Welcome to Will I Ever Learn Chinese? I'm Jeanette Sekel. In this episode, I'm talking about my experience of speaking Chinese in China. Finally, the real deal. About a year and 4 or 5 months into my Chinese learning journey, I traveled to China for the very first time. I had sometimes thought about traveling to China before. I had read some books set in ancient China, and I was interested in the Forbidden City and in some of the other places I encountered in the books. But this had never been high up on my list of travel destinations, not the least because I was so busy doing fieldwork in other parts of the world, and when I finally had some time for holidays, I tended to just enjoy spending these closer to home, without the massive upheaval of a very long journey like the one to China would be. Of course, I also had my regular trips back to Germany to see my parents and friends, so my traveling abilities were more restricted. Finally, I had always thought that I would only ever want to go to China if I spoke at least some of the language. It would open up so much more. I realized that I would be able to get around much easier. I like arranging my own travel schedule and not join a tour group, for example, and that would be facilitated by me speaking some of the language. So now that I had learned Chinese for over a year, I was ready. Coincidentally, the Chinese government had just announced a 15-day visa-free travel for citizens of some countries, including Germany, for which me and my daughter hold dual nationalities. Chatting to my teenage daughter, she was really keen to go as well, so we started to look for flights and arrange our travel schedules. This would be a chance for me to speak the language, but it would also be a great way to hang out with my daughter and show her some of the world, getting her interested in other cultures and gaining some first-hand experience of backpacking. Well, at least arranging your own travel, because backpacking as such is somewhat limited in China, because much of the accommodation has to be pre-booked due to entry requirements, and also there are restrictions on hotels to host foreign nationals. But nonetheless, we were there with our backpacks, with our hand luggage backpacks, and touring the country for 2 weeks. It turned out that my intensive learning of the language was really useful now. When we arrived at Beijing Airport, we went through immigration and navigated our way to the subway. It was all very straightforward. I was going to buy us Beijing travel cards for the public transport, but as we entered the subway station, I saw there were ticket machines instead. Joining the queue and then eagerly starting the process, I realized that I was not entirely sure which buttons to press, as I not always understood all of the characters. Also, I remembered then being in similar situations in other countries where I could read and probably speak the language pretty well, but still, there were sometimes weird terms and strange choices you had to make in these situations. So, for example, in the Netherlands, the questions would be, do you have a rail card? Do you want a single or a return? How many zones do you want? Questions that, unless you're from the area, are quite difficult to answer. I was still determined to make it, but at that moment, a lady tapped on my shoulder and signaled me to come with her. It turned out that she was an attendant, and she was helping me to get travel cards for me and my daughter. She did not seem to speak any English, but I started to speak some Chinese with her, and she then very efficiently helped me with the cards and told us where to go to get on the right trains into town. Phew, that was the first hurdle over and done with. Being on the subway felt surreal. I had immersed myself in the language so much that it felt strangely natural, but at the same time the language was now all around me, not just in my head or my headphones, but it was actually spoken around me. And it was also written because there were ads on the walls, signs warning to take care when getting on or off the train, and then the tannoy would announce the next station. Again, I had this strange feeling that, wow, this language is actually spoken. Again, I knew this in principle, but hearing it and being in the place felt so bizarre. We had to change trains once and then got to our destination, walking a short distance to get to our hotel. The first impression was how busy it was. Noise, people, scooters. A lot of Chinese restaurants in the area, I realized. Oh, wait, these were just regular restaurants here. We reached the hotel and I started speaking in Chinese with the lady at the front desk. She informed us that our room was not quite ready yet and we would have to wait in the lobby. At that stage, though, I was succumbing to exhaustion, jet lag, and just a general overwhelm. I asked her to repeat what she had said, and she then said it again, but followed it by a translation into excellent English. I smiled and thanked her in Chinese. Once rested, though, my Chinese abilities improved again, and I was readily speaking to people around me. For example, when buying snacks at the Family Mart, which is the local corner shop, or when ordering food in a restaurant, and so on. I also had the ability to speak some more to people I encountered along the way. In the Palace Museum, for example, the Forbidden City, we took a rest in one of the many gardens, away from the hustle and bustle. A lady who was already sitting there smiled and said, "Come, sit down," in excellent English. I thanked her in Chinese and we started chatting. It turned out that she was an academic teaching Chinese as a second language, and we had a chat about language learning. She was interested in what I was doing and how. My daughter obviously was there and she did not understand. She smiled politely and played with her phone, but then the other lady started to speak with her in English as well. And it turned out that the lady had a lot of different suggestions for us for what we could do in Beijing. She asked my daughter if she liked cats, for example, and oh yeah, that was a good topic. And then she suggested a very lovely cat cafe for us to go to. She also did a quick online search and found an excellent new vegan restaurant near that cat cafe for afterwards. So, we might have had this conversation with her in English anyway, if we had sat down and I hadn't spoken any Chinese. But I felt that by coming a bit her way and speaking Chinese, we had built a connection that was more than just polite conversations with some tourists. I felt at that stage I had access to the culture and the people in a different way. I eagerly spoke Chinese with others I encountered. The lady with her child waiting behind us in the queue for the dry slope toboggan ride down the Great Wall, who turned out to be incredibly lovely and up for a chat. The owners of a vegan restaurant in Hangzhou, who patiently explained the different dishes to us and then proceeded to give us a free tea ceremony while talking about their lives and how they grow their own organic vegetables, all in Chinese. We ended up visiting the restaurant every day while we were there, and it's still my daughter's favorite. When taking a taxi in the big cities, the drivers would see, tourists, and then take their phones and open the translation app. But when I would speak some Chinese to them, they would typically sigh a big relief. I talked to all sorts of people this way, heard their stories, and told them mine. Many ordinary Chinese people, it seemed, felt slightly intimidated by Westerners, or at least felt that they themselves could be seen as lesser and not as important, while the Westerners still seemed to hold some form of colonial power in some way. And this is reflected in the language too, in that Chinese kids all learn English, and those who can afford it go to the West for education, at school or university level, while very few people in the West learn Chinese. By me speaking Chinese and coming to China to visit, I was setting a counterexample, and again I was bridging a gap. One day, while staying in Beijing, we took the high-speed train to Shijiazhuang, a town about 300 kilometers away, which only took 1 hour on the train and only cost a few pounds. We visited one of my conversation teachers, who I was now very familiar with because we had met so often online, but never in person. She invited us to her apartment high up in one of the many tower blocks, and the lift up to the 26th floor took a mere few seconds. We then went for a walk and ended up in a local park where it turned out we were the celebrity visitors of the month. While Shijiazhuang is a very big city and the administrative center of one of the provinces, there are not many foreigners in the town and even fewer foreigners in the residential area we were now in. A shop owner rushed over and gifted my daughter a bubble gum, taking a few furtive photos outside his shop. The local dance troupe was out, older couples waltzing in a shady area at the back of the park. We looked on for a while and could see people glancing over. As we were walking on, a group of laughing men came over and shook our hands. I said ni hao, and they did a double take, and when I then progressed to speaking with them in Chinese, they immediately asked, "Are you from Russia?" And then, "How long have you been living in China?" This, it turned out, were two very regular questions I would encounter during my time in China. My Chinese was getting much more fluent as we were there, though sometimes I was still encountering unforeseen issues. Among the latter, it turns out, were those phone conversations. I mean, this is a whole other level of second language usage, having a phone conversation in the language. And my first phone conversation in Chinese, it turned out, was unexpected. The front desk of our Beijing hotel called the room to let us know that we had to change rooms. To a much better one, it turned out, because they had to have some work done in the part of the hotel where we were staying. I understood what they said, but I was a bit puzzled as to why we had to change rooms. Nonetheless, I said no problem and asked what the procedure would involve. They would send someone up, they said. When would it be convenient? We agreed on 30 minutes from now. As I was speaking on the phone, I noticed that I was putting on a foreigner speaks other language voice. Very monotonous, not really taking into account the tones at all, likely with a very strong German accent. I was also using extremely simple grammar and very simple words, almost like just putting some useful words together and not caring about anything other than getting the message across. This would be similar to, "Yes, we can do," "When you want us move," "How we get key." I would have known to say this in a much more fluent and coherent way, but in this situation, this was the only way I could speak in that moment while processing and attempting to understand what the other party was saying on the phone. This way of speaking, though, ensured that the outcome of communication was there. I didn't necessarily do it particularly well, but the message came across in Chinese. I realized that when some new contact languages form, such as pidgins, this is just about the same. The communicative goal is to get the message across, and not necessarily any grammatical correctness or perfect pronunciation or elaborate words. And even now, when I knew better, I was in a situation where I had to use this approach because it afforded me some much-needed processing time. The next time I had to speak on the phone, I was a bit more prepared, and it was slightly better, but still not perfect. I had found reviews of a high-end vegan restaurant in Shanghai, which was supposed to be very near our hotel, but it turned out that they had recently moved and the information was not up to date. We had just arrived in Shanghai and we were hungry, so I succumbed and called the restaurant to ask for confirmation of their new address. They were very lovely and explained how to find them, but then asked whether I wanted to make a reservation and how many people it would be for. Wait, I've done this in my initial learning program. But at that stage, I had not heard these words, let alone used them for over half a year, and I was stunned and did not know what to say. Again, the staff at the restaurant patiently explained the question, and I stumbled through the rest of the conversation somehow. Being in China had challenged my Chinese, that's for sure, but it had also reinforced what I had learned and helped me speak Chinese in a more natural setting. Of course, my daughter was with me, and I was speaking German and English with her, so I wasn't speaking Chinese all of the time, but I was experiencing the language in a new way, and we had such fun on our journey. I was seeing many of the places I had experienced in the dramas, and I got a new understanding of the country and its people. I realized how things were hanging together, how things worked. I was getting a true feeling for the place, and you can only really get this when you're there. It's very difficult to get this remotely. I had previously seen China in a very rosy light, from my desk somewhere in England. And of course, being in the place, there were things that I hadn't anticipated, there were things that I didn't necessarily like. As always, there are issues everywhere, and China is no exception. However, overall, the experience was so much more positive than I had expected. Everyone had told me that China was a very safe place, but it was not until I was there that I realized just how safe it was. And I really missed this later when coming back home to England. So, other than the ever-present motor scooters riding on pavements at high speed, it seemed it was totally safe to walk around at any time of the day or night, a woman on her own, people in groups, anywhere, anything. People were always extremely friendly and lovely. And also the country was so much more modern than I had expected and incredibly well kept and clean. The high-speed rail network was out of this world and just stunning and so convenient. You could get on a train in Beijing and after 4.5 hours arrive in Shanghai. That is a large part of the country you've just navigated and something that would take over an hour to fly. So it was really taking away the need to fly. The last few days in Shanghai, we were getting ready to fly home soon, and we trolled through local stationery shops and bookshops, exploring even some university bookshops out in the suburbs, away from the tourist places. In the evening, we would go and take a short stroll down to the Waitan, the Bund, watching the lights of the skyscrapers on the other side of the river. It was beautiful, it was magical, and we vowed to come back soon. Language-wise, going to China had been a massive milestone for me. I was able to speak Chinese in the real setting. And there were situations where I struggled, of course. There were times when I had to stop, ask the other person to repeat, and then move on. But I was able to do so without interrupting the conversation too often. I was able to rephrase what I was wanting to say when I lacked the relevant words. And I was met with a lot of goodwill and friendliness, because speaking Chinese as a foreigner in China is still an exception rather than the norm. Of course, there are a lot of foreigners in China and many of them speak excellent Chinese, but tourists and people working in China will often rely on their English, where many common Chinese people, even those who tourists may come into contact with, don't necessarily speak very much English. Of course, again, there are many exceptions. Yet, for me, being able to speak Chinese opened doors that I would otherwise have not been able to open. I wasn't just another tourist who only speaks English.